Welcome to Conversations on the Coast, the Bay Area's premier author interview program. And today we're very pleased that an author by the name of Linda Gordon has made it possible to come by. She has written to what I think is a very important book. The title is Dorothea Lange, and the subtitle is also important, A Life Beyond Limits. Thanks for coming by.
It's a pleasure to be there.
It's a very illustrated book, I should say, and nicely done in terms of the illustrations, published by W.W. Norton and Company. I'd like to start, if I may, with some of the things that David Oshinsky said in his very favorable review of your book recently in the New York Times Book Review. He writes, but perhaps the most iconic image, and he has gone through some of the iconic images, it's gracing textbooks, hanging from dormitory walls, affixed to political posters, even adorning a postage stamp, is Dorothea Lange's migrant mother taken at a California farm workers' camp in 1936. The photo shows a woman nurturing the child, gazing into space. She represents the spirit of America itself. In the midst of history's worst economic disaster, the mix of courage and compassion will lead a proud, invincible nation to endure. That's a pretty good description, I think, don't you?
I think so. There is just something that is so gripping about her face, which, despite being lined and worried, has a certain kind of beauty, but it's a beauty combined with extraordinary strength.
And sorrow, it seems, too, I think.
Well, anxiety.
Anxiety,
I mean, you couldn't have those kids and live in poverty without being worried sick.
And when I looked at that picture and read Oshinsky's words, the question came up to me, I don't know what sort of person could have created this iconic image. And the beauty of it is that with your book, we have an answer to that.
Well, I hope so, because actually, the power of that image has been such that I've learned that many people have the wrong impression that Lange was herself a person from a very, very poor and deprived background.
I'm raising my hand. That's what I thought. I'm sorry, but I did.
Of course.
Yeah.
In fact, I've run across people who think that Migrant Mother is a photograph of Lange.
Right. Okay, I've heard that too. It's quite amazing.
It is amazing, and it becomes all the more impressive, I think, what she did when you realize that this is a person from a really very sheltered middle-class life who found within herself a certain unusual capacity for relating to people who were very, very unlike her.
Very, very unlike her. The other thing is that your subtitle is terribly apt. The subtitle is A Life Beyond Limits. And that's just the way she lived it and just where I think she wanted to go, at least most of the time.
That's right, and the limits were many, and they began with her childhood polio. Another thing that I realized is that very few people know that she was a disabled woman as a result of that polio.
And there's one photograph in here that takes care of that. If anybody has any doubts, that amazing photograph that was taken here in San Francisco in connection with a class that she was giving.
That's right. When she taught at the San Francisco School of the Arts in the 1950s, she would regularly ask her students to photograph where you live. But by that, she did not mean your house or apartment. She meant something much more profound about what's at the core of your life. Yeah. So then one year, when the students challenged her to bring in a photograph of where she lived, she brought in this really extraordinary image of her twisted and sort of partly helpless foot.
Yeah.
That was where she lived.
Damaged by polio. And,
right.
But she was actually born in Hoboken, New Jersey, and educated in New York City public schools, and not a good student, you tell us.
Not at all, and she never went to college. This young woman, despite the disability, had just an extraordinary spirit of independence, and she was also entirely self-taught, really, as a photographer.
Absolutely, yeah. Nobody helped. Well, people helped, but there was no really formal education.
Right.
Dorothea Lange is a wonderfully comprehensive biography, and it gets into all kinds of things. Her triumphs, the setbacks, the husbands, and on and on. So just stay tuned.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.
Dorothea Lange, A Life Beyond Limits. That's the title of this wonderful biography by Linda Gordon, published beautifully by W.W. Norton and Company. The book is divided into several sections, and each section begins with a spread, if you will, two facing pages. And on the right-hand page is something called Scene, in this case, Scene 2. And on the left-hand page is one of her incomparable photographs. This one that I'm looking at is White Angel Breadline, San Francisco, 1932. The text starts, in the spring of 1932, San Francisco portrait photographer Dorothea Lange looked down from her second-floor studio window and saw the Depression. It's not that she had been oblivious for the previous 3 years. She could not have been, since her portrait business and her artist husband's sales had suffered mightily. But for such a visual-minded person, the images from her window disturbed her. The discrepancy between what I was working on and what was going on up the street was more than I could assimilate. And then in another couple of pages, you get back to that theme. And if I can get the page open, we'll read it. You write, within 3 years, Lange would close her studio permanently and become a documentary photographer. She would, in fact, recreate what documentary photography meant. What are you talking about there? Where was documentary photography when she got involved in it, and where did she take it?
Well, I think the bottom line is there'd been documentary photography for quite a while, but during this period, most photographers would say that there could be documentary photography and there could be art photography, but they were two entirely different things.
Uh-huh.
I think in some ways Lange was the photographer who first showed that documentary photography could be art. And it's that her vision of this is that she could present pictures of serious social problems, people suffering from poverty and from homelessness, without sacrificing her desire to make a photograph that was beautiful. And I do think that's the secret of her attraction to people and why her photographs were so popular, that she shows you people who are really suffering, but at the same time, the photographs actually supply to the viewer, I think, a certain kind of pleasure because of the beauty of the composition and the insight into individual personality that Lange had.
And also, I would say, because of her intention, and an intention as a photographer, which she first exhibited or practiced, if you will, when she was doing portraiture. She would always chat with the person, make sure that they were in a comfortable, not an uncomfortable pose. Nothing foreign to their way of life was used as a prop, so that she could see beyond the face and beyond the eyes to something deeper, I think she said, to something of the inner self.
Exactly. She had a kind of mystical streak, and she actually believed that she could see beneath appearances. But, she also was, at the same time, she was a very charismatic person, and she was able, through conversation, to draw people out of the kind of stiffness that most people assume when they're in front of a camera.
Mm. The other thing is that she used her physical problem, the fact that she walked, with that foot out of shape and so on, to her advantage. She would never, you write, never be able to make photographs of people in action that rivaled her photographs of people in contemplation. By now, her physical limitations were embedded. I love that, embedded in her photographic style, which was slow, contemplative, conversing, rather than shouting, quiet, rather than loud. Other limitations may be inherent in still photography. Chanting and yelling often render individual faces distorted. Historian Nicholas Natterson wrote of another photographer, quote, "An angry camera becomes a demeaning camera." And there she was, being herself with her, lack of ability to get around, and it informs and makes something very different and very wonderful of her photography.
I think so. Her disability did not make her weak. She was actually an extremely strong woman. She could hike for hours. She could climb on top of her car to get a little added height. But the one thing she could not do was run. She could not move quickly. And that was also produced by the fact that, she did not ever in this period use a 35-millimeter camera. She was using very heavy, big view cameras, as they were called, and she used a tripod whenever she could. So she was lugging around a lot of equipment.
Oh, boy. So many Dorothy Lange images were captured in the field. When we come back, we'll talk about how Dorothea Lange, quote, worked in the field, unquote.
You're listening to Conversations on the Coast with Jim Foster. Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email jimfostercoc@gmail.com.
Our guest today is Linda Gordon. She's an historian. She's a great writer, according to my lights. And she's written a new book published by W.W. Norton and Company. It's called Dorothea Lange, Life Beyond Limits. And Dorothea Lange is that great photographer whose images you have seen and you didn't even know whose they were. But now you know, Dorothea Lange. And Gary Gersel, who wrote a book called American Crucible, Race and Nation in the 20th Century, says in part, an astonishing and deeply moving biography of Dorothea Lange, America's foremost social photographer. No other account can rival this one for its engagement or for its dissection of the passions, injuries, and hopes that impelled Lange to challenge the boundaries of gender, race, and family. Linda Gordon writes about her complex subject with sophistication, frankness, and sensitivity. In the process, Gordon demonstrates yet again that she is among the most gifted and probing historians of our time. That's very nice. She really did challenge a lot of boundaries, didn't she?
I think so. She did. She first of all, she got divorced, which was scandalous in that period.
Yes.
That was not acceptable. Then she was doing this job, which required her to be on the road for months at a time. Yeah. Then she gave up entirely an extremely profitable portrait photography studio.
Right. Yeah. The other thing is when you said that she was on the road for a long period of time, she did something with the children. Is the phrase she put them out?
Placed them out, yes.
Placed them out, yeah.
This is a very, very disturbing and intense part of her life. I mean, this is not an easy life, and this is not a woman who did easy things. when she was offered this job by the federal government, which meant being on the road so much, she felt it was the chance of a lifetime, and she just could not say no. But in those days, daycare centers were not common. She had by then not only 2 children of her own, but
right.
3 stepchildren.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she placed them with other families to take care of them, sometimes families that she knew, but sometimes she placed them into paid foster families. And I interviewed these children, those who are still alive,
mm-hmm.
and they still remember with a lot of sadness and bitterness they're being left in that way.
Oh, my gosh. Well, the reason she was leaving them is because the work that she was doing, capturing in wonderful photography the essence of poverty in this country among farm workers and just in the rural part of this country, required her to go out in the field. And she wrote, "When you're out in the field, you found a way, but never like a big shot photographer, not as the big magazine boys do it now. We found our way in, slid in on the edges. The people who are garrulous and tell you everything, that's one kind of person. But the fellow who's hiding behind a tree is the fellow that you better find out why. So often it's just sticking around, not swooping in and swooping out in a cloud of dust, sitting down on the ground with people, letting the children look at your camera with their dirty, grimy little hands and putting their fingers on the lens, and you let them." That's the way she was. How great. Dirty
And
little hands on the
That's
lens.
really amazing because, to a photographer for whom a camera is practically a sacred object, that taking that kind of risk with a camera is extraordinary.
Absolutely extraordinary. Most photographers would wrap the little tykes on the knuckles, it seems to me.
Right.
And say, well, that kid shouldn't touch the equipment.
Right.
But she was interested in the person. She was interested in the child and what the child or the person might have to say.
And she also knew that the children could lead her to the adults.
Yes.
That when the children crowded around her, many of them had never seen a camera, of course. Then their parents would come over and to find out what was happening.
She had 2 marriages. She had 2 husbands. And the second one, Paul Schuster Taylor, an economist, and their life together, about their life, you have created a title for a chapter called Romance of Love, Romance of Cause. Quite an interesting title.
Well, it's a very, very unusual relationship. Many people, first of all, who get divorced, because her first marriage was not easy. Her husband was a womanizer and basically an absentee father. But many people, nevertheless, who get divorced, they'll choose a second partner who's more or less like the first partner.
Uh-huh.
I'm sure we've all seen that. Her second partner was almost 180 degrees opposite. We
call it the antithesis, don't we?
Right.
Yeah.
She went from a really bohemian artist to a very stiff, formal college professor.
I'm sorry to say we have to wind this up, Linda. It's been great talking to you about Dorothea Lange, A Life Beyond Limits. This has been Conversations on the Coast. I'm Jim Foster.
Now you can find this program on iTunes, SoundCloud, and all your favorite digital outlets. Follow the show on Twitter at JimFosterCoc and email JimFosterCoc@gmail.com.